Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for joining me. This Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, great speakers, sold out. Your idea, what did you want it to achieve?
Well, I would like it to achieve a new motivation for people, I suppose. It's not precisely a political conference. I would characterize it as a motivational conference, and that makes sense with regard to my involvement because I'm a psychologist and not a politician. And my sense of the world is that we are allowing ourselves to lose faith and courage and to accept an apocalyptic and limited view of the future and all of the tyrannical restrictions that are likely to accompany that because we're afraid. And I can understand why people are afraid. There's always reason to be afraid of the future because we're vulnerable and terrible things can happen to each of us and will and to our societies. But I think that courage and faith, wide-eye open courage and faith when confronting the future is the most appropriate stance. And I also think that the future is much more likely to be the sort of place you'd like to inhabit if you develop a positive vision of what that future could be and then work diligently to accomplish that in some ways regardless of the evidence, right? And that would be the faith component, is that you're called upon as a moral agent to act as if the future can be brought about in a positive way, all evidence to the contrary. And so that's part of the message that we're hoping to communicate at this conference.
Well, just to introduce the conference, you and another speaker, Bjorn Lomborg, who's been a regular guest here too, you co-wrote an op-ed saying among this catastrophizing you just talked about, well, look, even now that we've got two wars going now in the Middle East as well as Ukraine. In fact, the death rate from war last year was not much more than a tenth of the rate of deaths by war last century. Deaths from climate disasters, only a tiny fraction of what it was 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. We're richer. So why do you think there is this catastrophizing now?
Well, I think it's partly a consequence of our lack of genuine historical knowledge, and that's something that Bjorn has been very good at making public because he's very careful with his statistical models and his description of the actual past as opposed to the hypothetical past. And then I think that it's easier for bad news to sell, and in a marketplace where legacy media sources in particular, and perhaps everyone else, are desperate for clicks, it's easier to attract people's attention to the negative than it is to attract their attention to the positive. It's also easy if you're no longer naive and you say move from naive to cynical, which is a step towards wisdom, to assume that a clear-headed person would take a dire view of the future with all the terrible things that might make themselves manifest. But I think there's a step past that bitter cynicism to a courageous optimism, and I don't think that that story has been told very well. I don't think that political leaders have been able to develop, regardless of their position on the political spectrum, have been able to develop anything approximating a positive vision that people find compelling and attractive. And I guess the other thing that we're trying to offer to people as a potential positive vision is the notion that if each person took responsibility for their lives, we haven't had serious discussion of responsibility in our culture for about 6 decades. If each person took the requisite responsibility that could be part and parcel of their lives, they would find something useful and interesting and adventurous and compelling to do, and they wouldn't put themselves in a position where they were likely to fall sway to the blandishments of utopian centralizing globalists. And so part of the vision of ARC2 is a vision of subsidiarity, and that's an ancient concept. It's really the basis for a sophisticated conservatism, and it's predicated on the notion that true identity is to be found in the adoption of a hierarchical social mode of being. So you take responsibility for yourself, and if you can do that, then you take responsibility for your intimate partner, your wife or your husband, and if you can manage that together, well, which will keep you occupied in the attempt, then you could perhaps dare to raise a family, and maybe you could organize that properly, and that would also give you something to do. And then maybe you can extend that ability out into the local community, and you can build your identity upward to a more and more inclusive, to more and more inclusive and generalized levels, and find additional responsibility and meaning along the way. And one of the things we're really striving to do with this organization is to try to communicate to people the fact that the alternative to the top-down, centralizing, totalitarian, globalist vision isn't another vision of that sort. It's more the dissemination of the idea that each person has a very important role to play in bringing about a positive future, and the attempt to offer encouragement to people and recognition to them if they're actually doing that. And, you know, I've been very heartened by this as I've toured around the world, because I've been talking about the relationship between responsibility and meaning to my audiences and in my books for quite a long time. And it isn't part of our culture anymore that we don't do a good job of communicating the fact that the meaning that will sustain you in your life, especially through the difficult times, is to be found in the adoption of the fullest responsibility you can manage, and that's simultaneously the adventure of your life, and that if you do take all that on, then there's no reason for you to be a slave to the vision of someone or multiple someones who might want to control your destiny, you know, the destiny that you've abandoned. And so we've brought together people like Lomborg is a very good example, Bjorn Lomborg, who is very good at facing problems forthrightly and determining actual solutions, and pointing out as well that they're well within our capacity to manage. You know, I don't believe that we have to face an apocalyptic future of diminishing expectations. I don't believe the planet has too many people on it. I think that if we got our act together, even more than we have already, that the world could be an abundant place with plenty of opportunity for everyone. I think what we should be working toward is to make everyone as wealthy in the deeper sense as possible, and that if we did that as well, that people would start taking care of the environment on their own, because that's what happens when people have enough money, so that they don't have to burn up the present to ensure that the future will exist at all.
The thing is, you might have to talk down my own sense of alarm, because while I totally agree with you about the climate crisis, the exaggeration of it, the so-called climate crisis, and the fact we are getting richer, the fact the world has been more peaceful than historically, what does alarm me is the trashing of Western society that's produced all that. There seems to be a concerted attack on Western civilization, on its history, on its freedoms, instead of any appreciation for it. And without appreciation for it, you're not going to defend it.
Yeah, well, you expose the nakedness of your ancestors, so to speak, at your own peril. Right? We like to parade around our comparative virtue in the West because that's an easy way of appearing moral, and we do that by proclaiming as loudly as we possibly can that we're better in every way that can possibly be imagined than everyone who came before us. And there's a tremendous and desperate ingratitude in that, and it is very dangerous. It's not surprising that you would be alarmed by that. I think it is very alarming. It's easy for ungrateful people to take what they have for granted, and we would be fools in the West to take what we have for granted, because it's a bloody miracle that, for me, as far as I'm concerned, it's always a bloody miracle that there aren't constant, terrible riots in the street and everything in flames. You know, and we've had things comparatively good enough for long enough so that we've forgotten just how awful things can be. But I don't think that means that the situation is hopeless by any stretch of the imagination, because the other thing that I have observed, again in my lectures and as a consequence of the effect I've seen of the information that I've been relaying to people, is that you can remind people what's noble and virtuous about the culture that they exist in, while still being completely clear-headed and open-eyed about the catastrophes of the past and the present, and that you can invite people back to the to the noble adventure of the West, let's say, and people respond very positively to that, especially if you can break it down to the point where they can determine how to implement positive changes in their own life. And that's, I suppose, the psychological component of this. And so I don't think that the situation is desperate, although it's dire. We're in a strange time because we have more opportunity in front of us and more potential for catastrophe than we have had at any point in the past. And the reason for that is that we're much more technologically powerful and that things are transforming at a much more rapid rate than they ever have. And so that means that we could all go to hell in a handbasket in a particularly spectacular way, and we could create a deeper hell than any we've ever managed to produce in the past, which is really saying something. But I would say, by the same token, we could produce a world that's much better than anything we could have ever dreamed of, and that's an equally likely outcome, assuming that that's what we decided to aim for. And I also think that things are changing fast enough now, so we will see the consequences of that decision play out in the lifetime, in the near lifetime of people over the next few decades. Now, you might say, well, which of those two likelihoods is most likely to make itself manifest, the hell we could produce or the comparative, promised land of abundance and opportunity? And I would say that depends, and I really mean this and believe it, that depends on the decision of every single person who's currently alive. If we all aim up and we do what's necessary to make aiming up a reality, then we have an unlimited horizon in front of us. But if we are foolish and frightened and tyrannical and narcissistic and ungrateful and sinful, for that matter, then we could make things pretty damn miserable, and we could do it fast. We got a touch of that. We got a touch of that with the COVID crisis. We saw how fast we could lose our freedoms for a threat that was essentially non-existent.
Well, but this is the point. You're exactly correct there. I wonder whether my pessimism is from the fact that freedom seems under threat internally and externally. First, internally, it seems we've swung from a love of freedom to a fear of it. There's a fear of free speech, for instance, a fear of individualism. Instead, we're now getting a new tribalism, new identity politics, race politics, censorship. You're being an attempt to censor you by the organisation representing psychiatrists in Canada, for instance, now. Increasing fear of freedom. Is that how you see it?
Well, it's a real dichotomy, isn't it? Because although my clinical license, for example, is under threat in Canada, the threat is illusory as well as real, because there isn't really anything the board of psychologists, the governing board of psychologists, can do to me that's going to stop me. And at the same time that my freedom to speak is curtailed, or attempts have been made to curtail it, I also have a platform of communication that's unparalleled in history. I don't mean me personally, I mean all of us, because we can communicate the way we're communicating right now across the world, and we can communicate with millions of other people. And so it's another reflection of this same dichotomy that's at least partly produced by accelerating technology, is that there are rapidly moving threats to freedom. We could easily turn into a surveillance state that would put what's being done in China to shame, where absolutely everything we did, every breath we take, would be monitored and controlled. And we have the technology to make that possible, and I think that's a real threat. Now, that doesn't mean it's inevitable. I think that people can decide that that's not the pathway that they want to walk down. Now, one relatively recent occurrence that might make you optimistic in a perverse manner is the fact that we did transform ourselves in the West into a totalitarian state for about 2 years. And we did that because we mimicked China, which was a very bad idea. And we did that because of the hypothetical threat of COVID, which was obviously massively overblown, but we rolled it back. And so what I would say about that is that it demonstrated that when push came to shove, people decided in favor of freedom and against restrictions, and that prevailed. And I see no reason why we couldn't continue to make the proper decisions as we move forward. Now, one of the things I've tried to do as I've toured around the world and written is also to inform people that the idea that we should pursue security and safety at the cost of freedom is an illusion, because I don't think there is any security and safety in life apart from what you might garner around yourself if you lived an honest and productive life. I think that we need to be more forthright, especially with young people, about the fact that life is an apocalyptic risk and always has been, but that the right attitude towards that isn't to hide yourself under your bed and cower and be triggered by every little occurrence that might upset you emotionally, but to face the world with some voluntary courage and find out as a consequence of doing that that there's a lot more to you than you think. And this is certainly something therapists have discovered, real therapists, in the last 100 years, because we know perfectly well, and every therapist worth his or her salt knows this, that if you help people confront what they're afraid of and intimidated by programmatically and strategically and voluntarily, they get much braver and more competent. And that's the right pathway forward. And if you explain that to young people, I would say, and to older people for that matter, they're pretty damn excited about that possibility, because we're built for adventure and not for security. And if you can tell the right story of adventure, then it overwhelms the attractiveness of the story of security or the story of hedonistic gratification